In 1937, a 15-year-old girl was working on the set of a Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer musical. She was shooting one film while simultaneously preparing for another. The studio had her on a schedule that required her to be on set before dawn and working until late into the evening. When she was not filming, she was rehearsing. When she was not rehearsing, she was doing publicity. When she was not doing publicity, she was being photographed, or interviewed, or sent on promotional tours that covered multiple cities in multiple days, with no meaningful rest in between. She was 15 years old. And the studio had a solution to the problem of keeping a 15-year-old girl working at that pace without visible signs of exhaustion. They gave her pills, amphetamines, to keep her awake and energized through the shooting days that should not have been possible for a human body to sustain. And then, at the end of those days, when the amphetamines had done their work, when the girl's body was still running at a pace that sleep could not reach, they gave her barbiturates to bring her down, to make her sleep, so she could wake up the next morning and do it again. This was not a secret within the studio. This was not something that happened in shadow or without the knowledge of the people in charge. The studio knew. The producers knew. The executives knew. Judy Garland herself described it in interviews years later with the specific, matter-of-fact clarity of someone who has had decades to understand what was done to her. She said they would give them little pills to keep them going, and then other pills to make them sleep. And that this, she said, led to addiction, and that the addiction led to a lifelong struggle that she never fully escaped. She was talking about herself. She was talking about what Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, one of the most powerful studios in the history of Hollywood, did to a child. Now, before I tell you the rest of this story, before I tell you about the 2 abortions the studio pressured her into, or the man who called her his little hunchback while she was making him millions of dollars, or the 5 marriages, and the 3 children, and the Carnegie Hall triumph, and the financial ruin, or the bathroom in London, where she was found dead at 47 years old, with an estate worth less than the cost of a single MGM film reel. I want you to hold one thing. The girl on that set in 1937 was born Frances Ethel Gum in Grand Rapids, Minnesota in 1922. She was not yet Judy Garland. She was not yet Dorothy. Not yet Over the Rainbow. Not yet the woman who would be called the greatest entertainer of the 20th century by people who had watched her perform in concert halls across the world. She was a 15-year-old girl whose mother had handed her to a studio, and whose studio had handed her pills. And the story of what happened between that girl and those pills, and between that girl and the institution that gave them to her, is one of the most documented, most specific, and most deliberately minimized stories in Hollywood history. I am Mary, and today we are not going to talk about the tragedy of Judy Garland. We are going to talk about what was done to her by the people who made money from her, and what she did with what was left. Stay with me. Before MGM, before the pills, before the studio decided what she was going to be called, and how she was going to look, and what she was going to weigh, and what she was going to do with her body, when it produced a pregnancy they had not authorized. There was a little girl in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, who walked onto her father's theater stage at 2 years old to sing Jingle Bells because she heard the music and she simply could not stay off the stage. What that girl was, and what the institution that found her did with what she was. That is where this story begins. Frances Ethel Gum was born on June 10th, 1922, in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. Her parents were vaudevillians. Her father, Frank, ran a movie theater in town that also showcased vaudeville acts. Her mother, Ethel, played piano. The family lived inside music the way other families live inside ordinary routines. It was not something they did on special occasions. It was simply the texture of their daily life. Frances was the youngest of 3 sisters. Mary Jane was 7 years older. Dorothy Virginia was 5 years older. And Frances Baby, as her parents called her, was the one who completed the act. She was 2 years old the first time she performed. 2 years old. The music started, and Frances, who had been watching from the wings, walked out onto the stage and began to sing Jingle Bells. Not because anyone had told her to, not because she had been rehearsed or positioned or directed, because the music was playing and she could not stay off the stage. That quality, that specific, uncontrollable gravitational pull toward performance, never left her. Every person who knew Judy Garland at every stage of her life described it in the same language. She was most alive on stage, most herself, most in possession of a self that the world outside the stage was always threatening to take from her. But the world outside the stage was where everything else happened. And the world outside the stage was considerably less kind. The family relocated from Grand Rapids to Lancaster, California in 1926, when Frances was 4 years old. The official reason given was opportunity. California, Hollywood, the specific geography of American ambition in the 1920s where show business lived. The real reason was darker. There were rumors in Grand Rapids about Frances's father, about his relationships with men, about the specific, quiet scandal that a small Midwestern town in 1926 would have made of that information if it had surfaced fully. The family left before it did. Frank Gumm bought another theatre in Lancaster. Ethel began managing her daughters aggressively, pushing them into auditions, enrolling them in dance schools, doing the specific, relentless work of a woman who had decided that her children's talent was the family's ticket to something better than Lancaster, California. Frances watched her mother work, and she absorbed something from that watching that she would not be able to name for years. Her mother loved her, and her mother used her. Both of those things were true simultaneously. Ethel Gumm was not a monster, not in the simple, clean way that the Hollywood cautionary tale requires its villains to be. She was a woman of her time and her circumstances who saw in her youngest daughter's talent something that she had not been able to build for herself. She pushed, she managed, she made decisions about Frances's body and career and schedule that Frances did not have the age or the power to refuse. And when MGM came along, when the studio offered the thing that Ethel had been working toward for a decade, she handed her daughter over, without, as it turned out, asking enough questions about what the studio intended to do with her. In September of 1935, Frances was 13 years old. Louis B. Mayer asked a songwriter named Burton Lane to go and watch the Garland sisters perform at the Orpheum Theatre in downtown Los Angeles. Lane went. He reported back. Days later, Frances and her father were brought to MGM Studios in Culver City for an audition. She stood in front of the studio executives and she sang Zing Went, the Strings of My Heart. And then she sang Eli, Eli, a Yiddish song written in 1896 that she had learned for vaudeville. The studio signed her immediately. She was 13 years old. She did not have a screen test. She did not have a negotiated contract that protected her working hours or her physical well-being, or her right to make decisions about her own body. She had a studio contract, which in 1935 meant that Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer owned her professional life completely. What she filmed, what she wore, what she weighed, what she ate, and, as it would turn out, what she put into her body to keep it performing at the pace the studio required. Here is what MGM did with Frances Gumm first. They changed her name. Frances Gumm became Judy Garland, a name assembled partly from a critic named Robert Garland, and partly from a Hoagy Carmichael song, and partly from a George Jessel joke about a garland of flowers. The specific origin is disputed. What is not disputed is that Frances Gumm, the name she was born with, the name her father had given her, disappeared. She was Judy Garland now. Then they looked at her face. She was 4 feet 11 inches tall. She had what the studio described as cute or girl-next-door looks that did not match the glamorous persona required of MGM's female leading performers. She was self-conscious and anxious about her appearance in the specific way of a 13-year-old girl who has been placed in rooms with women like Lana Turner and Ava Gardner and Elizabeth Taylor and told by the most powerful studio in Hollywood that she does not measure up. The studio chief Louis B. Mayer called her his little hunchback. To her face. While she was making him millions of dollars, he also called her his ugly duckling. He said this to directors and producers, and anyone else in the studio system who needed to understand the specific institutional position that Judy Garland occupied, which was not the glamorous leading lady position, not the beautiful girl position, but the girl next door position, the bankable position. The position of a performer whose talent was so extraordinary that the studio could profit from it while simultaneously telling her, consistently and without apparent concern for what that telling was doing to a developing human being, that she was not beautiful enough to be loved for anything other than what she could do. She went to school at the studio, with Lana Turner, with Ava Gardner, with Elizabeth Taylor. Real beauties, as the director Charles Walters described them. Judy was the big money-maker, Walters said, but she was the ugly duckling. And he believed, and the record of her life supports him, that this had a very damaging effect on her emotionally for a long time. He said he thought it lasted forever, really. The studio did not stop at words. They put removable rubber discs inside her nose to reshape it. They put caps on her teeth. They put her in costumes specifically designed to minimize her figure to make her look younger, to keep her in the girl next door space that the studio had decided was her commercial lane. They put her on diets that she described in later years with a specific, quiet devastation. When she was filming The Wizard of Oz, they reportedly put her on a diet of cigarettes, chicken soup, and black coffee. She was 16 years old, and they put her on pills. This is the thing that every biography mentions, and almost nobody stays with long enough to fully reckon with. They gave her amphetamines to keep her awake and working, and they gave her barbiturates to make her sleep when the amphetamines had done their work. This was not occasional. This was not a response to a specific production crisis. This was the operating system, the routine. The thing that happened on that set, and the next set, and the set after that, because the studio had a schedule, and the schedule required a level of output that a human body cannot sustain without chemical assistance. Judy Garland was a child. She later described what happened with a clarity that has never been fully absorbed by the people who tell her story as a tragedy of excess. She said they had little pills for everything, pills to keep them going, pills to make them sleep. And she said that she could never understand, not even as an adult, looking back, how the people responsible for her well-being thought this was something they were allowed to do to a child. She said it led to addiction. She said it led to a lifelong struggle. She was being precise. The addiction that killed Judy Garland at 47 years old in a bathroom in London in 1969 began on the sets of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer in the late 1930s. It began with pills that the studio gave her, to a child, to keep her working. In 1938, Judy was 16. Something happened that would define the rest of her life in ways that nobody on that set could have fully anticipated. She was cast as Dorothy Gale in The Wizard of Oz. She was not the first choice. Louis B. Mayer had wanted Shirley Temple, the actual child star, the one with the ringlets and the dimples and the specific, manufactured cuteness that the 1930s American public had decided was what a little girl should look like. He tried to borrow Temple from 20th Century Fox. Fox declined. Deanna Durbin was considered. She was unavailable. And so, Judy Garland, the ugly duckling, the little hunchback, the girl with the rubber nose discs, was cast as Dorothy. She sang Over the Rainbow on that set in 1939. And something happened when she sang it, that the studio executives who had spent 4 years telling her she was not beautiful enough, not glamorous enough, not the right kind of girl, had not anticipated. The world stopped. Not metaphorically, literally. The song stopped people where they stood. It reached into something that audiences did not have language for and produced a response that all of Mayer's calculations about glamour and girl next door appeal had never produced. Over the Rainbow was almost cut from the film. The studio executives thought it slowed down the picture. They screened it without the song. The song was nearly removed permanently from one of the most successful films in Hollywood history. It was kept by the specific, stubborn insistence of the people who understood what Judy Garland had done when she sang it. She received an Academy Juvenile Award for her performance. She was 17 years old, and the studio that had called her a hunchback and put rubber discs in her nose and given her amphetamines to keep her working now had something it had not fully planned for. The most bankable actress in America, who was also the most damaged, who was already dependent on the pills they had given her, who was about to discover that the studio's response to the damage it had caused was not accountability. It was more damage. After The Wizard of Oz, Judy Garland was 17 years old and the most bankable actress in America. MGM had a problem. The problem was not the pills they had given her the pills. The problem was her body. Specifically, what her body did in 1941 that the studio decided was unacceptable, what they asked her to do about it, who asked her, and what that decision cost her for the rest of her life. That is coming. In 1941, Judy Garland was 19 years old. She had been working at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer for 6 years. She had made more than a dozen films. She had earned the studio millions of dollars. She had sung Over the Rainbow and received a standing ovation at the Academy Awards and been called the most bankable actress in America by people who understood exactly what bankable meant and had very little interest in what it cost. She was 19 years old, and she was in love. His name was David Rose. He was a band leader and musician, 31 years old, 12 years her senior, previously married to actress Martha Raye. He had proposed to Judy on her 18th birthday. MGM disapproved of the relationship. The studio disapproved of most things that Judy did outside of work, most things that suggested she was a human being with a private life rather than a performing asset with a schedule. They waited. Rose's divorce became final. They were married on July 27, 1941, at a small ceremony that the studio had not sanctioned and did not celebrate. Judy was 19. She was happy. She was, by the accounts of people who knew her during this brief period, genuinely happy in the specific, surprised way of someone who has spent years inside an institution that had no interest in her happiness, and has found something that the institution cannot fully control. Then she became pregnant, and the institution responded. What happened next has been documented. It is in the biographies. It is in the historical record. And it is the thing that the sanitized version of Judy Garland's story, the version that focuses on her talent and her tragedy, and the beautiful sadness of Over the Rainbow, consistently treats as a footnote when it should be the center. Her mother told her to have an abortion. The studio told her to have an abortion. MGM's position was specific and documented. A pregnancy would disrupt the filming schedule. A pregnancy would change the body that the studio had spent 6 years managing, the body they had put on diets and given pills and dressed in costumes designed to minimize it. A pregnancy would make Judy Garland temporarily unavailable. And temporary unavailability was not something that a studio contract in 1941 made room for. She was 19 years old. She did not want an abortion. By multiple accounts, including accounts from people who were close to her during this period, Judy Garland wanted the child. She had not chosen this pregnancy as a problem to be managed. She had chosen David Rose as a husband, and she had become pregnant in the way that married people become pregnant, and she wanted what that meant. The studio and her mother did not care what she wanted. She had the abortion. She was 19 years old. Now, I want to be precise about something here, because the way this story gets told, when it gets told at all, tends to move quickly past this moment. To acknowledge it in a sentence and then continue to the next film, the next comeback, the next performance that proved Judy Garland's extraordinary resilience. The resilience was real. But resilience is not the same as recovery. And what was done to Judy Garland in 1941, the specific removal of a pregnancy she had wanted, at the insistence of a studio that owned her contract and a mother who had handed her to that studio at 13, was not something that a resilient person simply absorbs and continues from. It was something she carried for the rest of her life, and it was not the last time. In 1943, 2 years after the first abortion, Judy Garland became pregnant again. This time, the father was not her husband. She was still married to David Rose technically. The marriage had been deteriorating for months under the specific, accumulating pressure of two people trying to have a private life inside a situation that did not permit one. She had been having an affair with the actor, Tyrone Power, one of the most beautiful men in Hollywood, married, unavailable in every sense that mattered. She became pregnant. And again, the studio and the people around her applied the same pressure. She had a second abortion. She was 21 years old. 2 pregnancies, 2 abortions, both at the insistence of an institution that had signed a 13-year-old girl and spent 8 years making decisions about her body as if her body were a studio asset rather than a human being's home. She and David Rose divorced in 1944. And in the wreckage of that marriage, in the specific, accumulated damage of 2 abortions and 6 years of pills and a schedule that had consumed everything that should have belonged to her private life. Judy Garland met the man who would become her second husband. His name was Vincente Minnelli. He was a film director, brilliant, gifted, meticulous in the way of artists who see the world primarily as a composition to be arranged. He was assigned to direct her in Meet Me in St. Louis in 1944. They had conflicts initially, creative conflicts, the friction of 2 strong artistic intelligences working in close proximity on a project they both cared about. And then something shifted. He saw her, not the studio asset, not the performing body, not the ugly duckling or the little hunchback or the girl next door who was not glamorous enough for the roles she deserved. Here, Judy Garland later described the early period of their relationship as one of the first times in her adult life that she had felt genuinely seen by another person. Vincente Minnelli looked at her on set and off with the specific, attentive regard of someone who found what he was looking at genuinely extraordinary. They married on June 15th, 1945. She was 23 years old. And on March 12th, 1946, their daughter was born, Liza May Minnelli, who would grow up to become one of the greatest performers in American history, and who would spend much of her adult life navigating the specific, complicated legacy of being the daughter of Judy Garland, who would struggle with the same dependencies, the same institutional pressures, the same gap between extraordinary talent and the world's capacity to protect the person the talent lived inside. But in March of 1946, she was simply a baby. And Judy Garland, who had lost 2 pregnancies to a studio's calculation about scheduling, held her daughter and was, by the accounts of everyone present, completely undone by love. The marriage to Minnelli did not last. They divorced in 1951. The reasons were multiple and complicated, and have been analysed by biographers with varying degrees of fairness to both parties. What is documented is this. Vincente Minnelli was a man whose primary relationship was with his work, whose attentiveness, the quality that had made Judy feel seen, was ultimately more available to a film frame than to a wife. And Judy Garland was a woman whose needs for reassurance, for presence, for the specific, constant evidence that she was loved, not for what she could produce, but for who she was, were needs that her marriage was not meeting. She was also, by this point, in serious trouble. The pills that MGM had given her from the age of 13 had done their work. The dependency that she had named clearly in later interviews, the lifelong struggle she had described with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who knows exactly what happened to them, was no longer manageable. She was missing days on set. She was arriving late, sometimes not arriving at all. In 1947, during the filming of The Pirate, she suffered a nervous breakdown. She was admitted to a private sanatorium. She was able to complete the film, but something had broken. Something that the comeback which would come, which was real, which produced some of the most extraordinary performances in Hollywood history, never fully repaired. In July 1947, she made her first suicide attempt. She was 25 years old. She cut her wrist with a broken glass. The cuts were minor. She was hospitalized. She received psychiatric treatment at the Austin Riggs Center in Massachusetts. She recovered, and then she went back to work. Because going back to work was the only thing she had ever been taught to do. MGM suspended her in July 1948. The studio that had given her the pills that had produced the dependency that was causing her to miss days on set suspended her for missing days on set. She was replaced in a film by Ginger Rogers. In 1949, while being treated for her addiction at Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in Boston, she was fired from Annie Get Your Gun. She had been struggling to perform. She had been late. She had been fighting with the director. She had been, in the studio's language, difficult. She was replaced by Betty Hutton. In 1950, she was suspended again. She was replaced in Royal Wedding by Jane Powell. After 15 years after 2 abortions and 2 nervous breakdowns and 1 suicide attempt, and the systematic chemical dependency that the studio had initiated when she was 13 years old, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer parted company with Judy Garland in September 1950. She was 28 years old. She had made the studio an extraordinary amount of money. Her estate at the end of her life, after 5 marriages and 3 children, and Carnegie Hall and A Star is Born, and decades of performing, would be worth $40,000. The studio that had given her the pills was not there when the bill came due. Here is what Judy Garland did after MGM let her go. She did not disappear. She went to the London Palladium. She was standing in the wings, trembling with fear. She was almost hysterical. She said she could not go out there because they were all going to be looking to see if there were scars, and it was going to be terrible. And then Bing Crosby walked out on stage ahead of her. He said, "We got a friend here. She's had a little trouble recently. You probably heard about it. Everything is fine now. She needs our love. She needs our support. She's here. Let's give it to her." And Judy Garland walked out. And the place went crazy, and she blossomed. Because that was the other thing about Judy Garland. The thing that exists alongside the pills and the abortions and the studio cruelty and the 5 marriages and the 47 years. She could not stay off the stage. 2 years old. Jingle bells. Her father's theater in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. The music was playing. And she walked out. And it was the same at the London Palladium at 28 as it had been at 2. The same specific, uncontrollable gravitational pull. The same aliveness that existed nowhere else in her life, with the same completeness. She said afterward, "I suddenly knew that this was the beginning of a new life. Hollywood thought I was through. Then came the wonderful opportunity to appear at the London Palladium, where I can truthfully say Judy Garland was reborn." The London Palladium was 1951. What came after it was one of the most extraordinary second acts in entertainment history. Carnegie Hall in 1961, A Star is Born, the Grammy for Album of the Year, the Kennedy Friendship, the March on Washington, and underneath all of it, running parallel to every triumph, the thing that MGM had given her at 13 that she could never fully put down, what the final years actually looked like. And the bathroom in London, and the $40,000, and what Liza Minnelli had to do after her mother died. That is coming. On April 23rd, 1961, Judy Garland walked onto the stage at Carnegie Hall in New York City. She was 38 years old. She had been fired by MGM 11 years earlier. She had attempted suicide twice. She had been through 3 marriages. She had been hospitalized for nervous breakdowns and addiction treatment, and the specific, accumulating damage of a life that had been running at an unsustainable pace since she was 2 years old. She walked onto that stage. And what happened next has been described by the people who were in that room, by the critics who reviewed it, by the musicians who performed with her, by the historians who have spent decades trying to find language adequate to what occurred as the greatest night in show business history. Not one of the greatest. The greatest. She performed for more than 2 hours. She sang 26 songs. The audience, which included Marilyn Monroe and Rock Hudson and Henry Fonda and Judy's own daughter Liza, who was 15 years old and sitting in the front row, responded with something that the reviews from the following morning struggled to describe accurately. It was not simply applause. It was not simply enthusiasm. It was the specific, overwhelming response of people who had watched someone survive something unsurvivable and had come out the other side of the watching changed. The 2-record live album Judy at Carnegie Hall was certified gold. It charted for 95 weeks on Billboard. It spent 13 weeks at number 1. It won 4 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year, making Judy Garland the first woman to win that award. She was 38 years old. The studio that had given her pills at 13 and called her a hunchback and forced 2 abortions and fired her at 28 had been wrong about everything. She was not the ugly duckling. She was this. But here is what the Carnegie Hall triumph cannot fully obscure: the life that produced that performance. The specific conditions under which Judy Garland had become the person who could walk onto that stage and do what she did were conditions that had cost her things that Carnegie Hall could not give back. She had been in treatment for addiction multiple times. She had attempted suicide twice, the wrist in 1947, the neck in 1950, a cut so minor it required only a bandage, but which the press reported as a slashed throat in the specific, appetite-feeding way that the entertainment press had always consumed Judy Garland's suffering. She had lost 2 pregnancies to institutional pressure. She had been through 3 marriages by the time she stood on that Carnegie Hall stage. And she was in debt. Not the ordinary, manageable debt of someone who has spent more than they earned in a difficult year. The specific, catastrophic debt of someone whose finances had been managed and mismanaged by a series of people who had seen in her earnings an opportunity that had nothing to do with her well-being. She owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Internal Revenue Service. She had failed to pay taxes in 1951 and 1952 years, when she was in the middle of addiction treatment and nervous breakdowns, and the specific crisis of a woman trying to hold a career together while her body and mind were processing what had been done to them. The IRS had not been interested in context. They wanted the money. In 1953, Judy Garland married Sidney Luft. He was her tour manager. He was also, by multiple accounts, a man who alternated between being her greatest professional advocate and being the person who struck her, which she testified to under oath during their eventual divorce proceedings. She filed for divorce from Luft multiple times, beginning as early as 1956. Each time she reconciled. Each time, the specific, complicated calculus of a woman who needed professional support and personal stability and was getting a version of both from the same person who was also hurting her, kept her in the marriage longer than she should have stayed. They had 2 children together. Lorna, born 1952. Joey, born 1955. She now had 3 children, Liza, Lorna, Joey, and a career that had produced millions of dollars and an IRS debt that was consuming those millions faster than she could produce them. And she made a film. A Star is Born was released in 1954. Judy Garland produced it herself through a production company she had formed with Sidney Luft. It was a large, serious undertaking, a remake of the 1937 film, directed by George Cukor, starring Judy, opposite James Mason. She gave everything to it. The performance she delivered in A Star is Born was by the consensus of critics and film historians who have spent 70 years watching it, one of the greatest performances in the history of American cinema. Not hyperbole, documented, repeated, consistently held critical consensus. The Man That Got Away Alone. If you have seen it, you know what I mean. If you have not, it is the kind of performance that makes you understand why people talk about Judy Garland the way they do. Why the language around her tends toward the superlative. Why Groucho Marx sent her a telegram after the Academy Awards that year, saying her loss was the biggest robbery since Brink's. Because she was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress, and she did not win. Grace Kelly won for The Country Girl. Judy Garland had just given birth. She could not attend the ceremony. A television crew was stationed in her hospital room to broadcast her anticipated acceptance speech. The camera was pointed at her. The world was watching. Grace Kelly's name was called. The camera crew packed up before Kelly could even reach the stage. Judy Garland, who had been given pills at 13 and called a hunchback and forced into 2 abortions and fired after 15 years and had come back to deliver one of the greatest performances in Hollywood history, did not win. What she felt in that hospital room, with the camera crew dismantling their equipment around her, is something she did not say publicly in terms that made it into the record. She kept going, because keeping going was the only thing she had ever been taught to do. The 1960s produced both the greatest triumph of her career and its final unraveling. Carnegie Hall in 1961, the Grammy, the standing ovation, the greatest night in show business history. Judgment at Nuremberg in 1961, a supporting performance so powerful it earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress. A dramatic role, proof, if any was still needed, that what Judy Garland could do on a stage or in front of a camera was not confined to musicals or girl next door formulas, or any of the categories the studio system had spent years trying to fit her into. CBS offered her a weekly television series in 1963, $24 million, the biggest talent deal in television history at the time. She said yes. She was in a desperate financial situation. The IRS debt had grown. Her earnings had been mismanaged by agents who, it later emerged, had been embezzling from her. She owed approximately $500,000 to the IRS and personal creditors combined. The IRS had placed tax liens on her home, her recording contract, every business deal from which she could derive income. She needed the money. The Judy Garland Show debuted on September 29, 1963. It was critically praised. Genuinely, consistently praised, the kind of reviews that a network dreams about for a new series. Nominations for 4 Emmy Awards, including Best Variety Series. CBS cancelled it after 1 season. They had placed it opposite Bonanza on NBC. Bonanza won. In the middle of the television series in 1963, the same year it debuted, and the same year JFK was assassinated, and the same year she attended a press conference to protest the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, Judy Garland had a 6-month affair with the actor Glenn Ford. This detail matters not for its scandalous content, but for what the people who wrote about it said. They described it as one of the more stable relationships of her later life. Think about what that means. A 6-month affair conducted while she was still technically involved with other people, while her career was being cancelled by a television network, while the country was in the specific grief of a presidential assassination described as one of the more stable relationships of her later life. The affair ended when Glenn Ford realized Judy wanted to marry him, and she was alone again. She divorced Luft in 1965. She married Mark Herron in 1965, a 4th husband, an actor, a marriage that lasted 5 months before separation. During the divorce proceedings, she testified that Herron had beaten her. He claimed he had only hit her in self-defense. She was 43 years old. She was $500,000 in debt. She had been fired from Valley of the Dolls in 1967, a film for which she had been cast primarily to generate publicity, according to co-star Patty Duke, and on whose set she had been treated poorly by the director. The IRS seized the majority of her earnings from her final engagement at the Palace Theatre in New York in 1967. Federal tax agents, on closing night, taking the money as she walked off the stage. In March of 1969, Judy Garland was 46 years old. She married for the 5th time. His name was Mickey Deans. He was a nightclub manager. She had met him recently. The marriage was fast, and the people around her had concerns that the people around her had always had concerns about her health, about her judgment, about the specific vulnerability of a woman who had been making herself available to people who needed things from her since she was 2 years old. They married at Chelsea Register Office in London on March 15, 1969. She was performing at the Talk of the Town nightclub in London at the time, a 5-week run. She was paid £2,500 per week. She made her last concert appearance in Copenhagen in March 1969. She came home to the rented house in Belgravia, London that she shared with Mickey Deans. And on the morning of June 22nd, 1969, Mickey Deans found her in the bathroom. She was 47 years old. The coroner stated that the cause of death was an accidental barbiturate overdose. Her blood contained the equivalent of 10 Seconal capsules. There was no evidence of suicide. The overdose had been unintentional, the accumulated result of a body that had been taking barbiturates since it was 13 years old and had finally reached the limit of what it could process. The pills that Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer had given a child in 1937 to keep her working. Those pills, 20,000 people lined up outside the Frank E. Campbell Funeral Chapel in Manhattan to pay their respects. They lined up through the night. Her estate at the end of a career that had spanned 4 decades, that had produced Carnegie Hall and The Wizard of Oz and A Star is Born and Judgment at Nuremberg and the Grammy and the Oscar nomination and the greatest night in show business history. Her estate was worth $40,000. Years of mismanagement, years of embezzlement by people she had trusted, years of IRS debt that had been compounding since the early 1950s. $40,000. Her daughter, Liza Minnelli, who had been in the front row at Carnegie Hall at 15, who had watched her mother become and unbecome and become again across a childhood spent inside the orbit of that specific, consuming talent work to pay off her mother's debts. With help from Frank Sinatra, $40,000, 5 marriages, 2 abortions, 2 suicide attempts, $500,000 in debt, a body that had been on pills since it was 13 years old, and a talent that the American Film Institute ranked 8th among the greatest female stars of classic Hollywood cinema. The question that the life of Judy Garland leaves you with, and it is not a question about tragedy, it is a question about accountability, is coming in the final part. Here is what Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer never said. Not in 1950 when they fired her. Not in 1954 when she delivered one of the greatest performances in Hollywood history and they watched the Oscar go to someone else. Not in 1961 when she stood on the Carnegie Hall stage and proved that everything they had called wrong about her was right. Not in 1969 when a coroner in London ruled that the cause of death was an accidental overdose of barbiturates, the pills that MGM had given a 13-year-old girl to keep her working. They never said they were responsible. They never said they were sorry. Mickey Rooney, who had been on those same sets, who had been given the same pills, who was the one person alive who had watched it happen from the inside, said in interviews, years later, that MGM was not responsible for Judy Garland's addiction, that she had chosen that path, that no one on that lot was responsible for her death. He said this, a man who had been given the same pills, on the same sets, by the same studio. And here is the thing about that denial, the specific institutional denial that MGM practiced and that Mickey Rooney repeated and that the entertainment press largely accepted for decades that I want you to hold. It required you to believe that a 13-year-old girl made a choice. That Frances Ethel Gum, who had been handed to a studio by her mother at 13, who had been renamed and physically altered and put on diets of cigarettes and coffee, who had been called a hunchback by the man who ran the studio, made an informed, autonomous choice about the pills that the adults around her were giving her. It required you to believe that. And for a very long time, for most of Judy Garland's life, and for decades after her death, the world largely did believe it, because it was easier. Because the alternative, acknowledging that one of the most powerful studios in Hollywood history had systematically damaged a child for profit, and then blamed the child for the damage, required a reckoning that the industry was not prepared to have. Here is what the life of Judy Garland actually tells you. Not about tragedy, about accountability. Judy Garland did not die because she was weak. She died because she had been chemically dependent since she was 13 years old, dependent on substances that the institution responsible for her care had introduced into her body. And because 47 years of that, dependency had finally exceeded what her body could process. She did not destroy her career through excess. Her career was shaped by an institution that extracted everything it could from her talent and provided nothing in return that protected her ability to sustain it. She did not fail at marriage 5 times because she was unstable. She was a woman who had been told since childhood that her value was entirely dependent on her performance, whose deepest relationships had been formed inside the specific distortion of a world where everyone around her needed something from what she could do, and who spent her entire adult life looking for someone who wanted her when the music stopped. The music almost never stopped. And when it did, when the Carnegie Hall ovations were over and the Grammy was on the shelf and the television crew had packed up and left her hospital room, what was left was a woman who had been given pills at 13 and 2, abortions at 19 and 21, and had been called a hunchback and an ugly duckling, and difficult and unreliable by the people who were making millions from her reliability. What was left was Frances Gumm, who had walked onto her father's stage at 2 years old because the music was playing, who had never, in 47 years of living, been adequately protected by a single institution that had power over her life. Here is the question I want to leave you with. Not about Judy Garland specifically. Mickey Rooney died in 2014. He was 93 years old. He had been on those sets. He had been given those pills. He outlived Judy Garland by 45 years. The pills that kept a boy working did not kill him at 47. The pills that kept a girl working did. I am not telling you this to draw a simple conclusion. The difference between what happened to Mickey Rooney and what happened to Judy Garland is not reducible to a single variable, but I am asking you to notice it. Because the story that the entertainment industry told about Judy Garland for decades after her death, and in many ways still today, is the story of a woman who could not handle her own talent, who was given extraordinary gifts and squandered them through personal weakness and excess, and the specific, self-destructive instability that the industry had always found slightly embarrassing to acknowledge in its most beloved performers. That story has a villain, and the villain is Judy Garland. The true story has a different villain. It has a studio that signed a 13-year-old girl and gave her amphetamines and barbiturates, and called her a hunchback, and forced 2 abortions, and fired her when the damage became inconvenient, and never once, not publicly, not privately, not in any document that has entered the historical record, acknowledged that what they did to Frances Ethel Gumm was wrong. That studio is still celebrated. Its films are still shown in theatres and on streaming platforms, and in film school classrooms where students learn about the golden age of Hollywood. The golden age. For whom? Judy Garland's daughter, Lorna, not Liza, Lorna, the one who wrote the memoir, the one who has spoken most directly about what it was like to grow up inside that orbit, said something about her mother that I have been thinking about since I first read it. She said her mother hated being called a tragic figure. She said we all have tragedies in our lives, but that does not make us tragic. She said her mother was funny and warm and wonderfully gifted, and that she had great highs and great moments in her career and great moments in her personal life. She said, yes, we lost her at 47 years old. That was tragic, but she was not a tragic figure. I think Lorna Luft is right. The word tragic implies inevitability, implies that what happened to Judy Garland was the natural consequence of who she was, of some fatal flaw inside the person, rather than a series of decisions made by institutions and individuals who had power over her life and used that power without adequate regard for what it cost her. Nothing about what happened to Judy Garland was inevitable. It was a choice, made by Louis B. Mayer, made by the studio executives who approved the pill regimen, made by the mother who handed her daughter over and asked too few questions about what would be done with her, made by the industry that consumed her and called the consumption her fault. Judy Garland did not choose to be dependent on barbiturates at 13. She was not given a choice. And the least we can do 60 years after that bathroom in London, 60 years after 20,000 people lined up through the night to say goodbye to a woman who had given them Carnegie Hall and Over the Rainbow and the greatest night in show business history, is stop calling it a tragedy of excess and start calling it what it was. I am Mary. If this story moved, you share it. Because Frances Ethel Gumm walked onto her father's stage at 2 years old because the music was playing, and the world that found her there never adequately protected her. The Judy Garland series continues. The full Kennedy series is here. And next, the woman who shared a name with the most famous song Judy Garland ever sang. The woman who went over the rainbow in a different direction entirely. That story is coming. I will see you there.